Welcome to Sleeping Times. Have you ever stopped to think about what it really costs to build something eternal? Imagine mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people, crossing scorching deserts and frozen mountains, working without machines or technology, only muscles, stones, and an ambition that defied every limit of the possible. The Great Wall of China didn't emerge from nothing. It was erected brick by brick, life by life, over more than 2,000 years. But did it really work? And what can the stories of the men and women who built it teach us about perseverance, sacrifice, and the true price of grandeur? If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next videos. Every week we bring you fascinating news stories to lull your nights to sleep. And don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always incredible to see how our community is spread across the world. Now, how about turning OU the lights, finding a comfortable position, and preparing yourself for a journey through mountains, deserts, and centuries of history, discovering how the longest structure ever built by humanity emerged stone by stone, and what it reveals about who we are when we dream too big. Long before the Great Wall existed as we know it today, there was only fear. It was the 7th century before Christ, and the vastness of the Chinese plains held a secret that few understood. The fertile land that fed millions was also an open road for invaders. The kingdoms spread across the territory lived in constant tension, gazing at the horizon with the same question that has haunted humanity since the beginning of time. How do we protect what is ours without becoming prisoners of our own fear? On the borders of the kingdom of Chu to the south, peasants piled rammed earth under the command of local lords. It wasn't grand, it wasn't elegant, it was just earth, compacted with feet and hands, mixed with branches and stones when available. These first walls were only 2 or 3 meters high, just enough to slow down cavalry or give a few minutes of warning when the dust of an invasion appeared on the horizon. They were humble, almost ashamed of their own fragility, but they carried a fundamental truth. Every great work begins small, almost invisible to the eyes of history. The kingdom of Qi to the east built its own defenses. There, clay was abundant, and builders learned that letting it dry in the sun transformed soft blocks into reasonable barriers. Have you ever stopped to think about how our ancestors discovered these things? There were no manuals, no YouTube tutorials. There was only trial and error and the patient observation of how nature worked. The clay cracked under the scorching sun, but in places where there was shade and controlled moisture, it hardened with surprising strength. Meanwhile, to the north, where the kingdom of Yan faced increasingly bold nomadic tribes, an innovation born from desperation emerged: double walls. Between 2 walls of rammed earth, builders dumped gravel and irregular stones, creating a barrier that not only slowed down invaders but also absorbed the impact of primitive battering rams. It was engineering born from necessity, that kind of creativity that only springs forth when survival is at stake. Isn't it fascinating how pressure reveals our capacity to innovate? The materials came from what the earth offered. In the south, interwoven bamboo served as the skeleton for mud walls. In the north, stones extracted from nearby mountains were stacked without mortar, depending only on weight and precise fit to stay in place. Each kingdom developed its own language of construction, adapted to the climate, the terrain, the enemies it faced. It was a time when military architecture was still learning to walk, stumbling through solutions that sometimes worked and sometimes crumbled with the first heavy rain. The lives of builders were dictated by the seasons. In winter, when the earth froze and became impossible to work, construction stopped. Men returned to their villages, repaired tools, healed wounds. In spring, when the thaw transformed the fields into muddy swamps, it was time to extract and transport clay. In summer, under a sun that cracked the skin, construction happened at a frantic pace. And in autumn, they rushed to complete sections before the first frosts made everything more difficult. It was a cycle that deeply connected human work to the rhythms of nature, something our age of air conditioning and artificial light has made us forget. Think about the scale of these initial projects. We're talking about walls that stretched for tens of kilometers, built without machines, without fossil fuels, without anything but human and animal muscle. A single kilometer of wall, 3 meters high and 2 meters wide, required about 6,000 cubic meters of material. Each cubic meter of rammed earth had to be excavated, transported, dumped, and compacted. It was work, measured not in days or weeks, but in years and decades. The tools were rudimentary, but effective. Wooden shovels with edges reinforced with iron when iron was available. Baskets of woven wicker to carry earth on shoulders or on balanced poles. Large stone or wooden rammers to compact the soil, lifted and dropped repeatedly by synchronized teams of workers. The rhythmic sound of these rammers echoed through the valleys, a constant beat that marked time like a giant heartbeat. Would that sound be comforting to those living nearby, a reminder that protection was being built? Or would it be oppressive, a war drum that never stopped? What motivated a peasant to leave his fields and build walls? For many, there was no choice. It was mandatory service, a form of tax paid not in rice or silk, but in sweat and time. Local lords called upon men for periods that could last months, and refusal meant severe punishment for the entire family. But there were also those who saw purpose in the work. Protecting the frontier was protecting the harvest, the children, the future. It was a collective investment in security, even if the price was high. The first watchtowers emerged during this time, elevated points built every few kilometers along the walls. Initially simple wooden platforms, they evolved into more robust structures of stone and rammed earth. From there, sentries could spot suspicious movements at considerable distances and, crucially, communicate with other towers through smoke signals during the day or fire at night. It was a communication system that, in its simplicity, allowed information to travel faster than any horse could run. How many invasions were prevented simply because a column of smoke rose at the right moment? Geography began to dictate not just where, but how to build. On flat terrain, walls stretched straight as blades, maximizing efficiency. But in mountainous regions they climbed and descended, embracing natural contours, using the hills as allies. Transporting materials uphill was brutal, so builders learned to use whatever was available locally. This created a fascinating diversity. Walls that changed character every 50 kilometers, reflecting the geology and resources of each micro-region. The diurent kingdoms rarely coordinated their efforts. Each built its own defensive network, sometimes creating strange overlaps, sometimes leaving dangerous gaps. There was no master plan, no unified vision. It was fractal construction, chaotic but organic, each piece responding to a local threat, a specific paranoia. This fragmentation isn't diurent from how we build our own defenses today, is it? Our digital firewalls, our suburban fences, our security systems, each built independently, rarely talking to each other, creating a patchwork quilt of protection. The most curious materials also found their place in the primitive walls. In some regions, tamarisk branches were interwoven in alternating layers with earth, creating a flexible structure that better absorbed blows. In others, porous volcanic stones were preferred because, despite being lighter, they offered surprising thermal insulation for the guard towers. There were even experiments with animal blood mixed into mortar, a technique that increased water resistance but required complex coordination between slaughterhouses and construction sites. Necessity, truly, is the mother of the strangest invention. Over time, these separate walls began to form a network, not by design, but by accumulation. When travelers journeyed along trade routes, they could follow these lines of defense like guides, finding outposts where they could exchange news, rest, resupply. The walls, built to divide and protect, inadvertently also connected. They became landmarks in the landscape, reference points that organized people's mental map of the territory. "I was born near the Western Wall," someone would say, and everyone would understand not just a place, but an identity. As decades transformed into centuries, these modest fortifications multiplied. By the 3rd century BC, there were thousands of kilometers of fragmented walls crisscrossing the territory we now call China. They didn't form a continuous line, didn't constitute an integrated system. They were scars on the landscape, some already in ruins, others constantly being repaired and expanded. And then a man with an ambition that would make future emperors seem modest rose to power. He looked at this chaotic mosaic of defenses and saw something diurent, the possibility of uniting it all into a single monument to his will. The question that began to echo was no longer, how do we protect ourselves, but rather, how big can we build when all the power is in the hands of a single man? In 221 BC, for the first time in recorded history, all the warring kingdoms bowed before a single throne. Qin Shi Huang, whose name literally means first emperor of Qin, was not a man given to half measures. He standardized writing, currency, measurements. He ordered books burned that contradicted his vision and had scholars buried alive when they protested. He was a relentless unifier, and his gaze soon turned to those fragmented walls that scarred his empire. In his mind, they were not enough. Something greater, more permanent was needed, something that would declare to the world and to posterity, this frontier is absolute, this empire is eternal. The decision to connect and expand the existing walls was not merely military, it was symbolic, almost spiritual. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall would be the physical edge of his power, the limit where civilization ended and chaos began. He saw the nomadic peoples of the north, the Xiongnu mainly, not as simple enemies, but as the antithesis of everything he had built. They had no cities, they didn't follow his laws, they couldn't be controlled by the systems he had imposed on the rest of the empire. The wall would therefore be more than defense. It would be a philosophical declaration. Have you ever considered how physical borders are, in fact, manifestations of ideas about who belongs and who doesn't? General Meng Tian received the impossible mission: coordinate hundreds of thousands of workers across thousands of kilometers. It was logistics on a scale that tested the limits of what the ancient world could manage. First, it was necessary to map. Teams traveled along the existing walls of the former kingdoms of Zhao, Yan, and Qin, assessing what could be incorporated and what needed to be rebuilt. Next, they traced routes to connect these segments, prioritizing defenses against the Xiongnu to the north. The challenge was not just technical, but human. How do you motivate or coerce such a massive workforce for a project that many would not live to see completed? The conscription was merciless. Soldiers, peasants, prisoners, all were mobilized. It's estimated that about 300,000 men worked simultaneously on diurent sections of the wall during Qin Shi Huang's reign. To put that in perspective, the total population of the empire was around 20 million people. This means that approximately 1.5% of the entire population was, at any given time, directly involved in this work. If we applied that proportion to the United States today, it would be like mobilizing almost 5 million people for a single infrastructure project. Can you imagine the scale of that social disruption? Workers came from every corner of the empire. Peasants from the south, accustomed to humid heat and rice paddies, found themselves on the frozen steppes of the north, where the wind cut like a knife and vegetation was scarce. Artisans from the cities, whose hands knew silk and fine ceramics, gripped shovels and rammers. Criminals served sentences that for many were equivalent to slow death. There was no uniformity, no adequate preparation. They simply arrived, received basic tools, and were expected to produce daily miracles. The logistics of feeding the workers was a constant nightmare. Grain had to be transported from productive agricultural regions to frontiers where little grew. Endless caravans of ox-drawn carts dragged themselves along newly built roads, another of Qin Shi Huang's infrastructure obsessions. But even with planning, hunger was a constant companion on the construction sites. Rations were minimal, calculated to keep men alive and functional, not comfortable. Thin millet soup became the standard meal, sometimes supplemented with vegetables preserved in salt or, on rare and celebrated occasions, a piece of dried meat. Construction under Qin Shi Huang's command marked a significant technical evolution. The ancient rammed earth walls were expanded and reinforced. In some sections, especially on flat terrain, where attacks were more likely, the wall reached 7 to 8 meters in height, with a width at the top sufficient for 5 horses to gallop side by side. This transformed the wall into an elevated military road, allowing rapid mobilization of troops wherever needed. It was defense and highway at the same time, a duality of purpose that demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking behind the brutality of execution. The watchtowers, which on earlier walls were irregularly spaced structures, now followed a calculated pattern. 2 towers should always be within visual range of each other, allowing communication by signals. Each tower was tall enough for guards to observe beyond the wall itself, detecting movements before they even reached the line of defense. Bonfires were kept permanently prepared, with dry fuel stored even during summer, ready to send alerts that could travel hundreds of kilometers in a matter of hours. It was an analog internet of warning, surprisingly effective. The emperor visited the works rarely, but when he did, his presence was felt for kilometers around. Sections were hastily completed, with cosmetic layers over structurally incomplete work. Nervous supervisors forced extended shifts to ensure that progress appeared more impressive than it actually was. This culture of appearances, where reporting success was more important than achieving it genuinely, created hidden weaknesses. Some sections of the wall built during this period would collapse decades later, simply because the rush to impress had compromised integrity. Does that resonate in any way with modern corporate or government projects, where presentation matters more than substance? Myths began to emerge almost immediately. People spoke of Qin Shi Huang consulting alchemists who provided magical potions to mix into the mortar, making it indestructible. Other stories said he had sacrificed 1,000 young virgins, burying them in the foundations to appease the spirits of the earth that resisted the construction. None of these stories were true, but their persistence reveals something profound. The project was so immense, so beyond normal comprehension, that people needed supernatural explanations to process its existence. The Great Wall, already in its infancy, was becoming legend beyond structure. Communication across thousands of kilometers of work was primitive. Messengers on horseback took days or weeks to traverse the length of the project. Orders from General Meng Tian, issued from the capital, arrived distorted or outdated at remote construction sites. This created accidental autonomy. Local supervisors made significant decisions based on personal interpretations of vague instructions. Some of the most interesting innovations of the wall emerged not from centralized design, but from this forced decentralization, where field engineers improvised solutions to problems that no one in central command had foreseen. The impact on society was profound and multifaceted. Entire villages were emptied of men of working age. Harvests rotted in the fields because there were no arms to gather them. Women assumed traditionally male roles, managing properties and businesses. a temporary social transformation that even when it ended would leave subtle marks. Elders and children worked beyond their capacity. The social network that sustained agricultural communities was stretched thin. Resentment grew, silent but palpable, a ferment of rebellion that would be reaped by the next generation. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BC, only 11 years after decreeing the great connection of the walls. He did not live to see his dream completed. In fact, what he accomplished was connecting and reinforcing about 5,000 kilometers of defenses, a fraction of what the wall would eventually become through subsequent dynasties. But he established a precedent, an architectural ambition that would echo through the centuries. After his death, his empire collapsed almost immediately, plunged into civil war. The wall, that symbol of absolute order and total control, could not even protect the dynasty that conceived it. The speed with which the Qin dynasty crumbled raises unsettling questions. Could the wall project, with its brutal demands on resources and labor, have been one of the factors that fatally weakened the empire? Was it an investment in long-term security that cost short-term stability? Historians debate this to this day, but there is an inescapable irony. Qin Shi Huang built the wall to create an eternal empire, but his own empire lasted less time than many of the wall sections he ordered built. When the dust of civil war settled and the Han dynasty took control, the wall remained, a silent witness to ambition and downfall. The new dynasty would look at this complicated legacy and ask a diurent question, not should we build, but rather how can we build better without making the same excesses? And in that question lay the next chapter of the wall, a chapter that would reveal uncomfortable truths about the human cost of monuments that defy time. Who were the people whose hands shaped each stone, each centimeter of mortar? They were not celebrated heroes. They had no names recorded in imperial chronicles. They were numbers, 300,000 here, 500,000 there, statistics conscripted and discharged as necessity dictated. But each number had a face, a story, a family left behind. Understanding the wall requires looking beyond the stones and contemplating the flesh, the bone, the sweat, and tears that erected it. It was an army of workers as diverse as the empire they intended to protect, united only by the common burden of a task that seemed to have no end. Peasants made up the overwhelming majority. Under the corvée system, each family was obliged to provide 1 month of work per year to the state, although in practice this often extended for much longer periods when the wall's needs were urgent. A father of 3 children on the southern plains might be notified in early spring that he should leave for the north before planting season. There was no appeal, no possible argument. He packed worn clothes, said goodbye to a wife trying to appear strong, and joined hundreds of other men on the long march to a place many had never imagined visiting. The journey to distant construction sites could take weeks. Columns of workers followed dusty roads, sleeping in the open or in makeshift shelters. During these marches, temporary bonds formed. Men from diurent villages shared stories, scarce food, worries about families left behind. Some would never reach their destination, succumbing to disease, accidents, or simply the exhaustion of the journey. There were no ceremonies for these premature dead. They were buried quickly in shallow graves by the roadside, marked perhaps by one stone piled on another, and the column moved on. On the construction sites, life took on a brutal routine. The day began before dawn, when darkness still dominated and the cold cut especially sharp in the elevated regions of the north. A thin millet soup served as the only morning meal. Then the work, excavate earth, carry baskets weighing up to 40 kilos on the shoulders, climb precarious ramps, dump, compact, repeat. There were no machines, no aid beyond the brute force of one's own body, and, in fortunate sections, a few pack animals. The pace was set by foremen who circulated with bamboo rods, ready to punish any perceived hesitation or slowness. Soldiers, another crucial component of the workforce, lived a diurent reality, but equally harsh. They weren't just building, they were defending the civilian workers from the same threats the wall intended to contain. Quick raids by Xiongnu cavalry were common in vulnerable sections. A group of workers could be quietly compacting earth when the sound of hooves appeared, and within minutes, chaos erupted. Soldiers ran to form defensive lines while peasants, without military training, fled or were cut down. These raids weren't aimed at conquest but disruption. Kill a few workers, destroy tools, sow fear. Among the workers were also the condemned. Criminals sentenced to wall work faced conditions even worse than conscripted peasants. They received less food, slept in more precarious shelters, were treated as disposable by supervisors. Many had committed relatively minor crimes: theft of food, disobedience to officials, unpaid debts. But the punishment was disproportionate. A 2-year sentence on the walls often became a death sentence, whether by disease, accident, or simply by physical wear beyond the capacity for recovery. How much of our modern progress was also built on forced labor and systematized injustice? Women, although rarely mentioned in official histories, were also present. Some followed husbands or fathers voluntarily, preferring the uncertainty of the construction sites to the desperate loneliness of waiting at home. Others were hired, a generous term, to cook, sew, care for the injured. Some worked on the construction itself, carrying water or lighter materials, especially in less dangerous sections. And there were inevitably those forced into prostitution, a trade that flourished on the margins of any large concentration of isolated men. They were marginals among the marginals, surviving as they could in an environment that was already hostile to everyone. Conditions varied drastically depending on location and time period. In the Gobi Desert, where some sections crossed, daytime heat could kill as surely as nighttime cold. Water was the most precious resource, more valuable than food. Workers developed a cruel hierarchy based on access to water. Those closest to supervisors, the strongest who could intimidate the weak, drank first and best. The weak waited, receiving only enough to keep functioning. Chronic dehydration made the work even more exhausting, a vicious cycle where the need for water increased while the ability to access it decreased. In the mountains, the challenge was diurent, altitude, and rugged terrain. Transporting materials uphill required double or triple the EUR compared to flat terrain. Falls were common and often fatal. One misstep on a narrow ramp, a loose stone, a moment of dizziness from exhaustion, and a man plummeted dozens of meters. There were no safety systems, no modern concept of preventing accidents. Accidents were expected, accounted for, but not prevented. How many fell? How much blood did the mountains absorb before allowing the wall to crown them? Communication between workers in diurent regions was hindered by diverse dialects. The newly unified empire housed a babel of local languages, and many peasants had never interacted with people beyond their provinces. This created isolation even amid crowds, a collective loneliness where each man stood physically beside hundreds, but emotionally alone. Work songs emerged as an attempt to create connection, simple, repetitive melodies that could be shared even when the exact words diluted. These songs also served to synchronize EU arts on tasks requiring coordination, like lifting heavy rammers or moving large beams. Injuries were epidemic. Hands became raw, manipulating rough stones or untreated wood. Backs curved prematurely under constant loads. Lungs filled with dust, causing chronic coughs that worsened over time. Infections in open wounds were common, as there was no adequate hygiene or effective medical treatment. Some sites had doctors, usually just older men with some knowledge of herbs. but their resources were limited. An infected wound often meant amputation with construction tools, sterilized only by fire, and with no anesthesia beyond perhaps a piece of leather to bite. Many preferred to die from the infection. The dead were a constant logistical problem. In some periods and places, there were so many that burying them properly became impossible. Mass graves were dug when time allowed. Otherwise, bodies were left where they fell, covered with a few stones. A persistent, though not historically confirmed, legend emerged that bodies were incorporated directly into the wall as filling material. Although modern archaeological evidence has not found human remains structurally incorporated on a large scale, the legend reveals an emotional truth. For those who were there, the wall was literally built of human lives, each stone marking a sacrifice. And yet, surprisingly, there were moments of humanity. Nights where, around small fires, men shared memories of home. A talented craftsman carving small wooden figures to trade for favors or simply to keep his hands occupied when work ended. Genuine friendships formed between people who, in normal circumstances, would never have met. Acts of kindness, sharing an extra portion of food, caring for an injured companion, protecting someone weaker from the brutality of foremen, dotted the landscape of Suyuering, small lights of decency amid the darkness. When a man completed his time of service and was released to return home, the journey back was almost as dangerous as the construction. Now weak, often sick, without resources, he had to travel hundreds of kilometers. Many couldn't make it. They died on the road, so close to freedom, but unable to reach it. Those who arrived found homes transformed, wives who had learned to live without them, children who barely recognized them, fields that didn't produce as before from lack of proper care. The wall didn't exact its toll only in direct deaths. It exacted it in shattered lives, broken families, futures altered irreversibly. But here's the question we must face. Without those hundreds of thousands, without their forced sacrifice, would the wall exist? And if it didn't, what else would history have lost or gained? The wall is celebrated as a marvel of engineering, a symbol of human perseverance. But whose perseverance exactly? The emperors who ordered it, or the countless unnamed who bled for it? And when we admire historical monuments today, our pyramids, our cathedrals, our skyscrapers even, how much comfort are we willing to feel, ignoring the human cost they hid in their foundations? How does an emperor's abstract ambition transform into the concrete reality of thousands of kilometers of fortification? The answer lies in the details that rarely capture imagination, but determine whether something lasts decades or millennia. The choice of materials, the refinement of techniques, the solution of 1,000 small engineering problems that only reveal themselves when you try to raise stones against the sky. The Great Wall is not a homogeneous structure. It is a patchwork quilt of construction experiments, each section reflecting locally available resources, the knowledge of builders, and lessons learned, often through catastrophic failures in earlier sections. In the arid north, where forests were scarce and stone abundant, the wall took on a diurent character from that built in forested regions of the east. Quarries were established near construction sites, and extraction work was as dangerous as construction itself. Rocks needed to be cracked using the fire and water method. Intense fires heated the rock's surface, then cold water was suddenly thrown on it, creating thermal cracks. Wooden wedges were then hammered into these cracks. When wet, the wood expanded, forcing the rock to separate into manageable blocks. It was a slow, unpredictable process that required intimate understanding of each rock type's characteristics. The mortar developed during the Han Dynasty represents one of the most impressive advances. The base mixture consisted of lime, obtained by burning limestone in specially constructed furnaces. But builders discovered that adding glutinous rice, not the whole grain, but a paste made from the liquid of cooking rice dramatically increased the mortar's strength and flexibility. The rice starch created microscopic polymeric bonds that made the structure less prone to cracking. Modern analysis has shown that this mortar had properties almost comparable to some contemporary cements. How did they arrive at this discovery? Probably by accident, when a desperate cook used rice water because clean water wasn't available, and someone noticed that this mortar performed better. The rammed earth technique, or hangtu, was refined to levels of true art. Wooden molds, usually about 1 meter long, were filled with earth in layers of approximately 10 centimeters. Each layer was then compacted using heavy rammers until maximum density was achieved. The sound of earth being compacted changed as density increased from a hollow thud to a sharper, more resonant sound. And experienced workers, knew exactly when a layer was ready by its timbre. It was empirical knowledge transmitted from person to person, almost musical in its application. Can you imagine learning to hear when earth is dense enough? The width of walls varied according to function. In areas of likely attack, the base could be 10 to 12 meters wide, gradually tapering to 4 or 5 meters at the top. This trapezoidal shape wooed maximum structural stability, distributing weight and resisting earthquakes and erosion better. But building with this profile required careful calculations. Too narrow, and the wall could collapse under its own weight. Too wide, and the waste of materials and labor became unsustainable. Engineers, although they weren't called that at the time, developed practical rules based on desired height, creating proportions that worked. Stones of diurent sizes were strategically positioned. The largest, some weighing more than a ton, formed the base and corners, points of greatest structural stress. Medium stones filled the outer and inner faces, creating two robust skins. The interior was often filled with rubble, smaller stones, gravel, compacted earth, in a system that economized on precisely cut stones but maintained mass and stability. It was intelligent construction, optimizing resources without compromising integrity, a concept modern engineers would call efficient design. The challenge of water was constant and multifaceted. Accumulated rain could weaken sections of rammed earth, so drainage systems were crucial. Small channels were carved or built along the top of the wall, directing water to specific points where it could drain without causing erosion. In some sections, especially in mountainous regions where water descended with force, the wall incorporated drainage tunnels, arched openings that allowed streams and torrents to pass through the structure instead of accumulating pressure against it. It's fascinating how water management problems from 2,000 years ago still challenge contemporary engineers. Watchtowers evolved in complexity. The earliest was simple elevated platforms, but eventually they became multi-story structures with diverse functions. The ground floor served as storage for supplies and sometimes shelter for animals. The second floor housed guards in rotating rest shifts. The third was the observation platform, equipped with permanent signaling equipment. Some larger towers, especially at strategic points, had up to 4 or 5 levels and could house garrisons of 50 or more soldiers for extended periods. They were mini-fortresses, capable of independent resistance if the wall was breached at other points. The distance between towers followed a specific calculation, 2 arrow shots range. A competent archer, using the composite bows of the era, could hit targets at approximately 150-200 meters. Therefore, towers were generally spaced 300-400 meters apart, ensuring that any point on the wall was within defensive range of at least 2 towers simultaneously. This created zones of crossfire, where enemies attempting to scale or breach the wall would face arrows from multiple directions. It was military geometry applied, transforming weapon limitations into positional advantages. In stretches that crossed the Gobi Desert, where stone and wood were non-existent, builders showed desperate ingenuity. Tamarisk, a hardy shrub that grew even in arid conditions, was cut and interwoven into mats. Alternating layers of tamarisk mats and compacted earth created a surprisingly durable structure. Salt, abundant in some desert areas, was mixed into the earth, hardening the mixture when dry. These sections weren't as imposing as those of stone in the mountains, but in their own context, they were marvels of adaptation, building something where, theoretically, nothing could be built. The logistics of transporting materials tested both creativity and human endurance. Stones too large to carry were moved using wooden sledges pulled by oxen or, on slopes, simply rolled when possible, a method that resulted in many cracked stones and some crushed workers. Earth ramps were built to reach progressively greater heights, then dismantled and rebuilt further ahead. On frozen terrain in winter, some clever supervisors discovered that pouring water on ramps created ice surfaces over which sledges slid with much less effort. It was opportunistic use of the seasons, transforming brutal winter into a temporary ally. Passage points, fortified gates where roads crossed the wall, were masterpieces of military engineering. Typically, they involved not one but multiple gates in series, creating kill chambers where invaders who breached the first gate would find themselves trapped under attack from all sides before reaching the second. The gates themselves were works of art. Dense woods, sometimes covered with bronze or iron plates, hung on massive hinges. Lifting mechanisms allowed blocking bars weighing hundreds of kilos to be positioned or removed with relatively modest effort, multiplying force through ingenious lever systems. Maintenance was an eternal challenge, often neglected in dramatic narratives of initial construction, but a wall doesn't remain standing for centuries without constant care. Permanent garrisons included maintenance teams whose task was to identify and repair damage, cracks in mortar, stones displaced by ice, erosion at the base. It was thankless work, less glorious than building something new, but absolutely crucial. Perhaps this reflects a broader truth. It's easy to get excited about innovation and creation, but sustainability and maintenance, though less exciting, determine what survives. Construction knowledge was transmitted informally. There were no engineering schools, no written manuals detailing techniques. A young man learned by observing a master, imitating, making mistakes, being corrected, sometimes gently, often brutally. This system meant knowledge could be lost if a generation of specialists died before adequately training their successors. And it happened. During periods of high mortality, specific techniques developed carefully over decades simply disappeared, forcing the next generation to rediscover them or replace them with inferior methods. Regional variation in construction quality is remarkable when examined archaeologically. Sections built near the capital, under direct supervision of imperial engineers, and with access to superior resources show meticulous work. Precisely cut stones, uniformly applied mortar, structures that remain in remarkable condition even 2,000 years later. But remote sections built by local teams with minimal supervision and inadequate resources reveal rougher, rushed work that collapsed centuries before. It was an accidental meritocracy of construction where quality correlated directly with proximity to power and resources. And then the inevitable question arises, did all this effort, all this technical sophistication work? Did the wall fulfill its stated purpose? The answer is complicated and will reveal surprising facets about what success really means for a fortification that was both symbol and practical tool of war. Numbers can be comfortably distant. When we say that hundreds of thousands worked on the wall, or that many died, it remains abstract. A statistic the brain processes without feeling deeply. But each number was a person with a name, a story, fear and hope. This chapter examines the human cost not as abstraction, but as lived reality. The shattered families, the shortened lives, the traumas that echoed through generations. It is an uncomfortable chapter, but a necessary one, because grandeur without awareness of its price is propaganda, not history. Estimates of mortality vary wildly, from tens of thousands to over 1 million across all centuries of construction and maintenance. The truth is, we don't know precisely. Detailed records weren't kept, or if they were, they didn't survive. But we know through fragmented chronicles and archaeological evidence that the mortality rate was high enough to transform going to the wall into an expression of popular dread, a fate equated with exile or death. Mothers would comfort children with warnings, behave or you'll be sent to the wall. It became a cultural boogeyman, materializing collective fears about the destructive reach of state power. The causes of death were as varied as they were horrific. Work accidents led the way: falls from heights during construction on mountainous terrain, crushing by rolling or falling stones, collapses of poorly built sections that buried workers alive. There was no safety equipment, no rescue protocol. When a section collapsed, those who could dig themselves out did so. The rest remained where they fell, eventually incorporated literally into the foundations of reconstructions. Was it common? Common enough that it didn't cause significant schedule disruptions. Diseases were even more prolific killers than accidents. Concentrating thousands of people in unsanitary conditions is a recipe for epidemics, and the wall sued several throughout the centuries. Dysentery, transmitted by contaminated water and lack of sanitation, could devastate a construction site in weeks. Typhoid fever erupted periodically. In winter, pneumonia and other respiratory infections reaped the already weakened. There were no antibiotics, obviously, nor even basic understanding of microbial theory. Treatments were useless at best, counterproductive at worst. Isolate the sick? Rarely done adequately, if at all. The work had to continue. Chronic malnutrition weakened immune systems, making everyone more vulnerable. The rations provided were calculated for minimum efficiency. Calories enough for a man to work until he died at a sustainable pace. Vitamin deficiencies caused scurvy and other debilitating conditions. Workers often resorted to eating what they could forage locally: roots, insects, small animals. But in many of the arid or mountainous regions where the walls snaked, there was little to find. Stories speak of men eating the leather of their own boots when hunger became unbearable. How many of these accounts are literal versus metaphorical is impossible to say, but their existence indicates the constant proximity of starvation. The cold in northern regions killed with silent efficiency. Workers, many from warmer southern regions, didn't have adequate clothing for winters where temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Hypothermia was common. Men simply didn't wake after sleeping in inadequate shelters. Frostbite mutilated fingers and toes, making workers less capable, often discarded as useless and left to their own devices. Without functioning extremities, without ability to work, and too far from home to return, many of these mutilated simply wandered until they succumbed to the elements or starvation. Violent conflict added another layer of danger. Xiongnu attacks were not rare, especially on sections that extended deep into contested territory. Cavalry appeared in raiding groups, targeting unarmed workers before military garrisons could respond. These raids were quick, brutal, psychological as much as physical, a reminder that the wall, even incomplete, had already provoked enmity. Some workers were captured, taken as slaves or hostages. Their families, waiting at home, would never know their exact fate, trapped in the limbo of incomplete mourning. But perhaps the most insidious killer was despair. Suicide on the construction sites, though not extensively documented, certainly occurred. Men who saw no end to suing, with no hope of returning home, sometimes chose a quick end over prolonged agony. Some simply walked into the desert or mountains and didn't return. Suicide or desperate escape. The result was the same. The conditions crushed not only bodies, but also spirits, a kind of death that statistics don't capture, but that was real and painful. The impact on workers' families radiated in concentric waves. A wife whose husband left for the wall faced an uncertain future. If he didn't return, and many didn't, she became a widow, though often without a official confirmation, just prolonged absence that hardened into certainty. As a widow, especially without adult children, her options were limited and terrible. Remarry if she could find someone willing, return to her family of origin if they would still accept her, or survive marginally through charity or hard labor. She perhaps wasn't physically fit to perform. Female lives were shattered silently, far from the construction sites, but equally victims of imperial ambition. Children grew up without fathers, raised by overburdened mothers or by communities doing their best. Some of these functional orphans would eventually be conscripted themselves, perpetuating a cycle of trauma. Others, especially girls, were vulnerable to exploitation. The social structure of entire villages was destabilized when a significant percentage of working-age men disappeared, creating waves of economic and social dysfunction that persisted beyond the eventual return of some survivors. There were also psychological consequences for those who survived and returned. Today we would call it PTSD, but at the time there was no vocabulary or understanding for psychological trauma. Men returned taciturn, violent, unable to readapt to domestic life. Nightmares about collapses or attacks haunted them. Some developed dependence on alcohol or opium, trying to numb memories. The wall had marked them irreversibly, and these invisible marks passed to families who didn't understand what had transformed their loved ones into strangers. Protests and rebellions were risky, but not non-existent. There are records of mutinies at specific construction sites when conditions became intolerable even by the brutal standards of the time. These uprisings were crushed with exemplary violence. Leaders were executed publicly, often in grotesque ways designed to discourage future rebellions. Participants were subjected to severe punishments: whipping, mutilation, extended periods of work under intensified surveillance. The message was clear: obey or sue you a fate worse than current suing. Some dynasties, learning from revolts that helped topple their predecessors, attempted modest reforms. The Han dynasty, for example, implemented more predictable rotation systems and reduced, at least in theory, the duration of mandatory service. Grain payments to workers' families were instituted intermittently, but these measures were implemented irregularly and often reversed when fiscal priorities changed. Genuine reform would have required acknowledging that the wall was, fundamentally, a project of massive exploitation, an admission no emperor was willing to make. The legends that emerged about the wall often centered on sue-wearing. The story of Meng Jiangnu is the most famous, a woman whose husband was forced into wall construction and died there. Desperate, she traveled to find him, and when she learned of his death, she wept so bitterly that a section of the wall collapsed, revealing her husband's bones among the rubble. It's myth, not history, but like all powerful myths, it encapsulates emotional truths. The wall consumed lives, shattered loves, and the grief it generated was so immense it could, metaphorically, bring stones tumbling down. Contemporary comparisons are inevitable and uncomfortable. When we build infrastructure today, dams, highways, skyscrapers, how much of the human cost do we honestly acknowledge? Even today, migrant workers on some projects face conditions that, while better than ancient China, still involve significant exploitation. The 2022 World Cup in Qatar was built by migrant workers whose conditions and mortality rates raised international alarms. The scale is diurent, the justifications have changed, but the underlying dynamic, grandeur achieved through exploitation of the vulnerable, persists. Are we really so far removed from the wall builders? We must also ask, did those who sacrificed know what they were creating? For most, probably not. A man carrying stones on a remote section didn't see the wall as a totality, didn't conceptualize his place in a 1,000-year project. He saw only another day of brutal work, another piece of wall that looked like yesterday's piece and tomorrow's piece. The historical importance of the wall was irrelevant abstraction when his feet bled and his belly growled. What should make us reflect on our own historic projects? How many of those who execute them share the vision or benefit we claim they represent? The Great Wall was not built all at once by a monolithic empire. It was built, neglected, rebuilt, expanded, and reimagined through dynasties that rose and fell over more than 2,000 years. Each era viewed the wall through distinct political and strategic lenses, leading to periods of feverish investment alternated with decades or centuries of abandonment. Understanding this episodic evolution reveals as much about the internal dynamics of Chinese empires as about the wall itself. After all, why did some generations become obsessed with walls while others simply ignored them? After the collapse of the Qin dynasty, the Han, 206 BC, 220 AD, inherited the wall along with a newly unified empire. But their approach was pragmatic, not ideological. Han emperors faced the same Xiongnu threat that had motivated Qin Shi Huang, but added a diurent strategy, diplomacy, and trade. The famous Silk Road was formally established during Han, connecting China to Central Asia and beyond. The wall was extended westward through the Hexi corridor, not just to defend, but to protect these lucrative trade routes. Signaling towers multiplied in the Gobi Desert, stopping points that also served merchants. It was fortification that doubled as economic infrastructure. Intelligent, multifunctional. During Han, the wall reached its maximum westward extent, reaching regions that today are part of Xinjiang. These sections were diurent, more sparse, less imposing, adapted to the realities of defending immense territories with stretched resources. Small fortresses connected by curtains of low walls and signaling towers created a surveillance network that depended more on mobility and quick communication than on impenetrable physical barrier. It was the wall acknowledging its own limitations and adapting, but then came the period of fragmentation. When Han collapsed in the 3rd century AD, China plunged into centuries of division. During the dynasties of the south and north and later the Three Kingdoms, no central power controlled Suyuitian territory or had the stability to maintain the wall extensively. Sections fell into decline, some literally crumbling, others being dismantled by local populations who used the stones to build houses, temples, or other fortifications in civil wars. The wall, without an empire to sustain it, began to return to the earth from which it was raised. Reunification under the Sui dynasty, 581–618 AD, brought renewed interest, but it was brief. Sui invested in rebuilding key sections, but the dynasty was unstable and fell quickly. Then came Tang, 618–907 AD, one of the most glorious eras of Chinese civilization. Curiously, Tang invested relatively little in the wall. Why? Because Tang expanded Chinese borders so far beyond the wall that it became largely irrelevant as a frontier defense. The Tang Empire, at its height, controlled much of Central Asia. The frontier was hundreds of kilometers north and west of the wall. During Tang, the wall became a relic, a reminder of times when China was smaller, more insecure. The Song dynasty, 960–1279 AD, faced a diurent dilemma. Song never controlled territory in the north comparable to Tang or Han. In fact, they spent most of their existence threatened by powerful nomadic states. First the Khitan, Liao, then the Jurchen, Jin. Song invested in defenses, but often not in the ancient Great Wall. It was either outside their controlled territory or considered indefensible given its extent. Song focused on fortifying cities and building smaller, more manageable defensive systems. The Great Wall in this period continued its slow deterioration in uncontrolled or disputed regions. Then, in the 13th century, came the Mongols. Genghis Khan and his successors conquered not just China, but much of Eurasia, creating the largest contiguous empire in history. For the Mongols, the wall was irrelevant. They simply ignored it, passing through weak points, corrupting guards at gates, or simply circumventing it when necessary. Under the Yuan dynasty, 1271–1368, established by Kublai Khan, the wall was not maintained. After all, why would they maintain a barrier against themselves? It was an embarrassing reminder that fortifications, no matter how impressive, are only as strong as the will to defend them and the competence of those who operate them. The true transformation of the wall into something close to what we know today happened under the Ming dynasty, 1368–1644. Ming came to power by expelling the Mongols, and their relationship with the steppes was one of existential paranoia. The threat now came not from the Xiongnu of 2,000 years before, but from the remaining Mongols to the north and, later, from the rising Manchus to the northeast. Ming decided to rebuild and reinforce the wall on a massive scale, transforming it into the iconic brick and stone structure we photograph today. Why did Ming invest so much? Because, unlike Tang, Ming never managed to control or stabilize the northern frontier through lasting conquest or diplomacy. The wall was an admission of weakness as much as a display of strength. Ming construction was revolutionary in scale and quality. Instead of rammed earth, entire sections were rebuilt with fired brick, far more durable, but also exponentially more expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Brick kilns were established near construction sites, consuming massive quantities of fuel, a problem in already deforested regions. Millions of bricks were produced and transported, each sometimes marked with the kiln, the supervisor, or the military unit responsible, allowing traceability and punishment if a section failed due to inferior quality. Ming towers and fortresses were architecturally sophisticated. Some of the fortified passages, such as Badaling or Mutianyu, famous sections near Beijing, had multiple levels of defense, architecture that anticipated advances in siege artillery. There were chambers for storing weapons, grain, water. Quarters for permanent garrisons were built with some relative comfort, not luxurious, but recognizing that soldiers needed to live there for years. Heating systems using kangs, heated sleeping platforms, were incorporated in the coldest regions. But even Ming, with their massive investment, couldn't defend the entire wall adequately. The fundamental problem persisted. The wall was too long and defenders were too few. It's estimated that even during periods of maximum garrison, perhaps 1 million soldiers were distributed along 6,000 kilometers of Ming fortifications. That's less than 200 soldiers per kilometer, more than enough space for determined infiltration, especially in difficult terrain where visibility and communication were limited. The wall worked when well garrisoned and well commanded. In the many moments when it wasn't, it became security theatre, impressive from a distance, but ineffective up close. The cost of maintenance was also cumulative and unsustainable. As Ming declined in its final centuries, resources to maintain the wall adequately decreased. Sections were left to degrade, garrisons were reduced or left unpaid, becoming banditry as much as defense. The final nail in Ming's co-win didn't come through the wall, but around it. The Manchus, forming the Qing dynasty 1644–1912, entered through the betrayal of a Ming general who simply opened the gates. It didn't matter how many bricks had been stacked. Loyalty was more crucial, and Ming had lost it. Under Qing, a conquering Manchu dynasty, the wall again lost military purpose. Qing expanded Chinese borders to incorporate Manchuria itself, Mongolia, and beyond. The wall was deep within controlled territory, no longer a frontier, but an antiquity. Some maintenance occurred on sections near Beijing more for symbolic value and prestige than strategic necessity. Most of the wall was simply abandoned, left to erosion, climate and depredation by rural populations who saw in it not a monument, but a convenient quarry. This trajectory through the dynasties reveals a fundamental truth. The wall was useful only when it coincided with specific strategic needs and when resources and political will aligned. It wasn't automatic or inevitable defense, but a tool that depended entirely on how it was employed. This questions simplistic narratives about its effectiveness, effective when and for whom, and it makes us think about our own security infrastructure. How many do we build driven by panic or precedent, maintain by inertia, and only recognize as obsolete when it's already too late? It's easy to imagine the Great Wall as a static line of stone stretching across empty landscapes, but that image is incomplete. For centuries, the wall was more than a fortification. It was a complex human ecosystem. Thousands of soldiers, along with their families, merchants, artisans, and all those who sustained a permanent military presence, lived along its length. The fortresses and garrisons transformed stretches of the wall into communities, small societies with their own hierarchies, economies, and cultures. Understanding these lives is understanding how dead stone became living defense. The fortresses were the heart of this system. Not simple towers, but fortified complexes that could house hundreds or thousands. Take as an example a typical Ming period fortress. Thick, external brick walls created a defensive perimeter within which there were barracks, storage depots, workshops, wells, even small temples to pray for divine protection. It was a miniature walled city, designed for autonomy in case of siege. Ovens for bread, blacksmith shops for repairing weapons and tools, stables for horses, everything compacted into optimized space. The life of a garrison soldier was monotony punctuated by occasional terror. Most of the time there were no attacks, there were patrols, maintenance, surveillance. The work was tedious, requiring constant attention to a horizon where rarely anything happened. Imagine being in a watchtower in the freezing winter of the steppes, shift after shift, watching darkness where every shadow could be enemy or simply wind-shaping snow. Mental numbness was real, and when true attack came, the transition from boredom to chaos was disorienting. Garrisons were generally rotated, but not with modern frequency or regularity. A soldier could be assigned to a frontier post for several years. Workers and specialists sometimes spent entire decades at the same fortress. For many, especially those who brought families, the fortress wasn't a temporary posting, but home. Children were born, grew up, and some eventually enlisted, never knowing another place. Generations could pass with the wall as their only horizon, creating deep local identities, but also isolation. Communication systems were vital and surprisingly sophisticated. The network of signals using daytime smoke and nighttime fire had specific protocols. One fire or smoke column meant enemy presence sighted, perhaps 100 cavalry. Two signals indicated a larger group, between 500 and 1,000. Three meant substantial force, above 1,000, requiring serious military response. Some towers used more complex variations, disorientating direction of approach or type of threat. It was primitive binary code, transmitting complex information through simple means. Under ideal conditions, warning could travel from one extreme tower to central command in less than a day. Impressive for a pre-telegraph era. But human systems fail. Towers needed clear line of sight, so fog, sandstorms, or snow interrupted communication. Sleepy or intoxicated guards didn't notice signals from neighboring towers, breaking the chain. Communication failures allowed multiple successful incursions throughout the wall's history. It was a reminder that technology, although primitive, is only as reliable as the people who operate it. Provisioning the garrisons was a perpetual logistical challenge. Remote fortresses depended on supply caravans that traveled periodically from interior regions, bringing grain, salt, cloth, weapons. These caravans were vulnerable to attacks, severe weather, and corruption. Supply oases diverting resources for black market sale. When supply chains failed, and they failed regularly, garrisons resorted to local cultivation, hunting, or informal trade with neighboring inhabitants, sometimes including the very people they were supposedly defending against. Interactions with neighboring nomads were more complex than simple hostility. Periods of peace or truce allowed trade through designated gates. Nomads exchanged horses, furs, animal products for Chinese grain, cloth, and metal. Soldiers and nomadic merchants often developed relationships, even friendships. Some frontier garrisons had informal agreements: don't attack during certain seasons, and we'll facilitate trade. This local pragmatism complicated the simple us versus them narratives emperors preferred to promote. On the frontier, survival often required moral flexibility. Women in the fortresses played crucial roles, but invisible in official histories. Soldiers' wives cooked, mended clothes, cared for the wounded, and in emergencies picked up weapons. There are occasional reports of women fighting to defend fortresses when men were overwhelmed, though these stories are rare, not because they didn't happen, but because official recorders rarely considered female actions worthy of note. The presence of families humanized the garrisons but also created vulnerabilities: dependents to protect and feed, potential hostages during attacks. Religion and superstition permeated garrison life. Small temples or shrines honored warrior deities, local gods, ancestors. Soldiers performed rituals before patrols or after escaping danger. Amulets were carried, prayers murmured. In an environment where death could come suddenly and with no apparent rational explanation, faith argued a sense of control, connection with forces greater than oneself that could protect or explain suturing. This isn't fundamentally different from modern soldiers carrying talismans or developing pre-mission rituals. Internal conflicts within garrisons were also inevitable. Rigid hierarchies created resentments. Corrupt officers provoked occasional mutiny. Regional differences among soldiers, dialects, customs, loyalties, caused friction. Gambling, disputes over women, where there were any, or simple stress from prolonged confinement led to violence. Some commanders governed through brutal discipline, publicly executing deserters or the insubordinate. Others employed a more paternalistic approach, trying to cultivate loyalty through relatively fair treatment. Success varied, but fortresses where morale was low were strategically weak, regardless of how many bricks were in the walls. Desertion was a chronic problem. Soldiers fled to the steppes, sometimes joining nomads who ironically oured freer lives than imperial service. Others fled inland, becoming bandits or trying to disappear in anonymous villages. Punishments for captured desertion were terrible, execution was common, but for many, the risk was worth the attempt to escape a life they considered hopeless. How many skeletons on the steppes mark routes of failed escape? We will never know. During declining dynasties, garrisons often became semi-independent. Without regular payment from central government, local commanders levied fees, extortion, from merchants, plundered nearby villages, or rented protection to nomads in exchange for tribute. The wall, in these circumstances, transformed from a line of national defense into a base for local warlords. These corrupt garrisons were sometimes a greater threat to Chinese civilian populations than the nomadic invaders supposedly kept on the other side. And yet, amid all this, there was ordinary humanity. Soldiers carved board games into stones to pass time, musicians improvised instruments, bringing brief moments of beauty to harsh life. Stories were told around fires, blending fact and fantasy, creating local folklore. Marriages were celebrated, babies were born, Elders died and were buried in small cemeteries outside the fortress walls. The wall was stone, yes, but also countless lives lived in its shadow, each leaving an invisible but real mark. Thinking of the wall only as a physical structure is to lose half the story. It was a living organism maintained by a constant flow of humanity, blood, sweat, hope, fear. And that current of human life flowing along its length, as much as the stone and brick, defined what the wall really was. Without people to watch it, defend it, live it, the wall was just a line of rubble stretching across landscape. With them, it was a living frontier, porous and complex. How diurent are our modern borders, with their guards, their border communities, their informal economies that exist specifically because the border exists? The Great Wall doesn't traverse a single, immaculate landscape. It winds through some of the most challenging and diverse geographies on Earth. Each kilometer presented unique problems of engineering, logistics, and survival. Understanding how the wall adapted to vertiginous mountains, arid deserts, river valleys, and open plains reveals as much about the character of the project as any discussion of politics or construction technique. Geography wasn't just backdrop, it was an active character dictating what was possible, shaping decisions, defining limits. In the Yanshan Mountains, north of Beijing, the wall reaches some of its most iconic and dramatic stretches. Here it climbs and descends steep ridges, embracing topography with almost stubborn determination. Building in this terrain was logistically brutal. Materials had to be carried uphill, often through trails that barely existed before construction began. Mules and donkeys could help only so far. On steeper sections, everything was carried on human backs. Imagine transporting bricks weighing 5 kilos each, one by one, climbing slopes where each step requires conscious effort, repeatedly, day after day. The strategic advantage of building in mountainous terrain was clear. Attackers faced a terrible tactical disadvantage. Cavalry, so effective on open terrain, was almost useless on narrow ridges. Infantry attempting to climb while defenders fired from above ensured devastating losses. But these advantages came with a cost. Defending required garrisons at altitudes where simply living was challenging. Thin air, more intense cold, greater isolation. Rescuing or reinforcing mountain positions during emergencies was slow and dangerous. Passages through mountains, valleys and gorges were critical points that received especially heavy fortifications. Major gates like Shanhaiguan, where the wall meets the sea, and Jiayuguan, its western extension, were masterpieces of defensive architecture. Multiple walls, overlapping towers, double or triple gates, permanent barracks housing thousands. Controlling these passages meant controlling movement between the steppes and agricultural plains. Not just militarily, but commercially. Terriers charged on goods transiting generated substantial revenue that helped finance wall maintenance, creating economic incentive beyond the strategic. Contrasting dramatically, the desert sections of the wall faced completely diurent problems. In the Hexi Corridor and the Gobi Desert, water was the supreme resource, determining where construction was even possible. Construction sites had to be near oases or rare underground sources. This forced the wall's routes to follow water lines, not always aligning perfectly with ideal defensive needs. It was a compromise between what was desirable and what was survivably possible. Materials in the desert required creativity. Without forests to provide wood, without quarries of solid rock in many areas, builders used what was available: earth, tamarisk, porous volcanic stones, even layers of salt. Desert walls were generally lower, narrower than their eastern mountain equivalents. They didn't need to be as imposing because the desert itself acted as a complementary defense. Invading across vast, empty deserts with an army large enough to seriously threaten presented immense logistical problems. The desert wall functioned more as an early warning system, punctuating hostile territory with signaling towers that could alert about movements before any invading force reached more populated and vulnerable regions. Sandstorms were constant enemies. They could literally bury sections of the wall in days, requiring continuous excavation work. Sand penetrated everything: equipment, food, clothes, lungs. Desert garrisons sue you at elevated rates of respiratory diseases. The constant abrasion of sand-carrying wind wore down even stone gradually, an erosion process that accelerated structural deterioration. Some desert towers were abandoned, not because they were attacked or unnecessary, but simply because maintaining them against the relentless advance of the desert was a Sisyphean task. In the rare stretches where the wall crossed open plains, the challenges reversed. Here, construction was easier. Flat terrain, simpler transport, materials often abundant. But defense was harder. Without natural terrain advantages, the wall depended entirely on height, thickness, and attentive garrisons. These sections needed to be more substantial, more expensive, and they were the most vulnerable to simply being circumvented if enemies chose to ignore them and penetrate at less defended points. Rivers presented another set of problems. The wall had to cross numerous watercourses from modest streams to substantial rivers. Small streams could be incorporated through tunnels or fortified bridges. Larger rivers were inevitable gaps in the wall's continuity, defended by fortresses on both banks and, sometimes, underwater chains or stakes to hinder crossing. But these were always potential weaknesses. A determined enemy could concentrate earwarts on these gaps, breaking through where the walls simply didn't exist. Floods were destructive. Rivers that seemed docile most of the year could transform into torrents during rainy season or spring snowmelt. Water flowing violently corroded foundations, collapsed sections near banks. Repeatedly rebuilding the same sections year after year became a frustrating routine in some locations. Eventually, some engineers accepted that certain areas were unsustainable and repositioned the wall to higher ground, creating strange detours or redundant segments that confuse modern observers. The climatic diversity along the wall's length also cannot be underestimated. Sections near Beijing experienced all 4 seasons distinctly: hot, humid summers, frozen, dry winters. Further west, the climate became progressively more extreme. Greater diurnal temperature swings, scorching summer temperatures, and even colder winters, minimal precipitation. Garrisons in diurent sectors faced dramatically diurent survival realities. A soldier transferred from a relatively temperate eastern post to a desert fortress in the west, or vice versa, experienced significant adaptation shock. Ecologically, the wall also impacted the environment. Massive deforestation for brick kilns for fuel for construction-altered landscapes. Some regions that were forested when construction began became virtually treeless in the wall's vicinity over centuries. This exacerbated erosion, changed drainage patterns, impacted wildlife and local populations dependent on forest resources. The wall left ecological scars that persist, though subtly, to this day. And here's the fundamental truth: the wall never dominated geography. It always negotiated with it. Where geography was favorable, the wall was impressive and durable. Where geography was hostile, the wall was a precarious compromise requiring continuous "you ought" just to exist. This reflects a broader reality about human ambition versus nature. We can build incredible things, but nature always has the final word. Our own modern constructions, cities in seismic zones, developments on floodplains, structures struggling against rising sea levels, aren't they just contemporary versions of the same eternal conflict between what we want to build and where the world will allow us to build it? There is a peculiar tragedy in abandoned monuments. The Great Wall, built with superhuman AU art, guarded by generations, would eventually be left to rot slowly under sun, rain, and human endurance. This chapter explores the centuries when the wall lost strategic relevance and became, in many eyes, merely an inconvenient relic. It is a history less of dramatic destruction and more of gradual erosion, stone crumbling, purpose disappearing, meaning transforming. The decline really began under the Qing dynasty, though seeds were planted earlier. Qing, as a conquering Manchu dynasty, came from the north, from beyond the wall. For them, maintaining it as a frontier defense made no sense. Their own homeland was on the wrong side. More importantly, Qing expanded Chinese borders to incorporate Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. The true frontier was now hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers beyond the wall. It lay deep in the interior, its military function obsolete. Maintenance largely ceased. Some sections near Beijing were kept for symbolic value. Emperors occasionally visited, and it was convenient that these sections looked impressive. But the vast majority, especially the remote western extensions, was simply abandoned. Garrisons were withdrawn or drastically reduced. Towers were left empty. Without repairs, natural processes began reclaiming what humans had built. Erosion was the first and most relentless force. Rain infiltrated cracks, expanding as it froze, breaking stone and mortar. Wind carrying sand or ice particles wore down surfaces. Plant roots, especially from hardy shrubs that colonized the structure, forced blocks to separate. Gradually, year after year, sections began to crumble. Without human intervention, the very nature the wall tried to contain reclaimed it, converting decades of work into rubble in relatively few generations. Humans also became agents of dismantlement. For rural populations living near the wall, it was a free and convenient quarry. Stones were removed to build houses, fence fields, pave roads. Bricks, especially the superior quality ones from Ming sections, were valuable. Why work hard extracting and processing new ones when millions were conveniently stacked on the forgotten wall? This mining of the wall was especially intense during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when China was turbulent, government was weak, and no one policed or cared. Some stretches were deliberately demolished for modern projects. During the Republican era, 1912, 1949, and especially after the People's Republic was established in 1949, sections of the wall were sacrificed for highways, railways, dams. It was a symbol of old China, imperial, feudal, backward, and there was little sentimentality in destroying it for infrastructure representing progress and modernity. During the Cultural Revolution 1966-1976, some Red Guard units attacked sections of the wall explicitly as representatives of the four olds, old ideas, culture, customs, habits, that should be eliminated. Ironically, the wall survived nomadic invaders for centuries, only to be attacked by compatriots. Narratives about the wall also changed. During periods of dynastic decline, it was often cited in literature as a symbol of tyranny, a reminder of forced labor, of human cost, of imperial excess. The legend of Mengjiangnu mentioned earlier became popular precisely because it implicitly criticized the ambition that consumed countless lives. For many ordinary Chinese across centuries, the wall wasn't a source of pride, but a painful reminder of how power could be used oppressively. Westerners discovering the wall in the 19th and early 20th centuries often expressed more admiration than many contemporary Chinese. Explorers, missionaries, and eventually tourists were astounded by the scale. They photographed, wrote marveling accounts, created narratives of wonder. This external perspective eventually influenced Chinese perceptions. If foreigners considered the wall a world wonder, perhaps there was value in it beyond a shameful relic. This re-evaluation wasn't instantaneous or uniform, but it planted seeds of conservation. Initial preservation attempts were limited and disorganized. Some sections near urban centers received sporadic attention, but the vast majority continued to be neglected. There was, until very recently in history, no robust concept of cultural heritage on a national scale. In an agrarian society where daily survival consumed most people, preserving ancient structures thousands of kilometers away wasn't a priority, especially when those structures had no obvious practical function. The awakening came gradually in the second half of the 20th century. As China stabilized politically and began economic development after 1978, attention turned to heritage. The wall was rediscovered internally as a national symbol, no longer the shame of feudal times but pride, testimony to Chinese ingenuity and perseverance. This rebranding was partly genuine cultural re-evaluation, partly a deliberate nation-building project, government promoting the wall as a unifying icon. Both motives, pragmatic and sincere, drove conservation arts. In 1987, UNESCO designated the Great Wall as a World Heritage Site, formally recognizing its universal importance. This brought international attention and some funding for preservation, but it also created tensions: how to balance tourist access, a crucial revenue source, with protection of a fragile structure. Sections like Badaling were extensively restored, almost rebuilt, and now receive millions of visitors annually. Critics argue these sections are more Disneyfication than authentic preservation, sanitized versions presenting the wall as it was idealized, not as it was or is. Meanwhile, many remote sections remain in advanced decay, unvisited, unrestored, continuing their slow collapse. Some conservationists argue these wild sections are, paradoxically, more authentic and valuable precisely because they show the wall in its natural state, without modern intervention. There are complex debates about how much to restore versus how much to leave in authentic ruin. Questions without easy answers, reflecting broader tensions between preservation, authenticity, access, and economy. The abandonment and rediscovery of the wall raises interesting philosophical questions. What makes something valuable? The wall didn't fundamentally change between the 19th century, when it was ignored, and today when it's celebrated. What changed were human attitudes, cultural contexts, social needs. Value, then, is not intrinsic, but assigned, fluid, constructed. And if that's true for the Great Wall, it's true for all our monuments, traditions, identities. Recognizing this is disturbing, but also liberating. It means we can consciously choose what we value, rather than assuming value is fixed and given. And so the wall slept for centuries, forgotten by most, slowly returning to the earth. Its reawakening in modern consciousness hasn't completely reversed that sleep. Large sections still sleep, silent in remote landscapes, visited only by wind and occasionally by curious hikers. This sleep wasn't waste or simple tragedy. It was a necessary interlude, a period of rest between epochs of meaning, allowing the wall to transform from military tool into cultural symbol. And in that transformation lies its next chapter. Not as defense against external enemies, but as a bridge connecting the present Chinese and world consciousness to a complicated but fascinating past. In the 21st century, the Great Wall found new life not through military function, but as a tourist icon, national symbol, and global cultural phenomenon. It is now one of the most recognizable structures on the planet, photographed incessantly, admired by millions, debated by conservationists, exploited commercially. Understanding the wall today means understanding not just ancient stones, but also what we project onto those stones, our fantasies, our nationalism, our concerns about heritage and identity. Tourism has transformed sections of the wall dramatically. Badaling, less than 2 hours from Beijing, receives about 10 million visitors annually. To accommodate these crowds, the area has been intensively developed. Parking lots, visitor centers, cable cars, souvenir shops. The wall itself has been so restored that little original material remains. It's essentially a modern reconstruction using traditional methods. This creates an accessible and impressive experience, but some argue it sacrifices authenticity. Are you really visiting the Great Wall or a theme park based on the Great Wall? Other sections offer diurent experiences. Mutianyu, also near Beijing but less developed, maintains more original character while still being touristy. Wild sections like Jiangku or Gubeiku, not officially open to the public, attract adventurers willing to hike without infrastructure, experiencing the wall in its natural state of decay. These sections are dangerous. Loose stones, collapsed steps, no emergency services, but for some, they are a more genuine connection with history. The economic impact of wall tourism is substantial. Communities near popular sections have prospered, transforming from agricultural villages into commercial zones. Hotels, restaurants, guides, drivers, entire local economies revolve around the wall. This brought wealth, but also rapid and sometimes destabilizing cultural change. Young people abandon agriculture for tourism jobs. Local traditions become performative for visitors. Prices inflate beyond the reach of long-time residents. It's development, but not always unproblematic progress. Contemporary Chinese nationalism frequently invokes the wall. It's taught in schools as a symbol of resilience and national unity. Political events use it as a symbolic backdrop. During periods of nationalist tension, rhetoric about defending the Great Wall appears metaphorically. This political use is deliberate and powerful, but also simplistic. The wall, as we've seen, has a complicated history. Not always euective, often associated with suyuring, built and rebuilt by dynasties that hated each other. Reducing it to a one-dimensional symbol of national pride erases important nuances. Internationally, the wall is synonymous with China itself. It's probably the first image that comes to mind when many Westerners think of the country. This confers soft diplomacy power. China uses the wall in tourism branding, cultural diplomacy, promoting the image of a nation with deep history and impressive achievements. But it also creates a reductive stereotype. China is more than its wall, just as France is more than the Eiffel Tower, or Egypt more than pyramids. Icons are useful, but also limiting. Conservation of the wall in the 21st century faces technical and conceptual challenges. Technically, how do you stabilize 2,000-year-old structures without destroying authenticity? Modern materials, cement, synthetic resins, are more durable but anachronistic. Traditional techniques, lime, glutinous rice, are authentic but labor-intensive and expensive. Diurent sections receive diurent approaches, sometimes causing inconsistency. There's no clear consensus on best practice, just ongoing debates among conservationists, government, and local communities. Conceptually, how much of the wall should be preserved? Is it feasible to conserve all 8,000 kilometers, including all branches and redundant sections? Clearly not. So how do you choose? Prioritize the most visited sections, the oldest, the most intact, the most architecturally diverse. Each criterion produces diurent priorities. And when resources are limited, but they always are, these choices mean some sections will be sacrificed, left to continue collapsing. Who decides which pieces of history are worth saving? Modern technology offers new tools. Drones map remote sections, creating detailed digital records. 3D scanning preserves structural information even if the physical structure crumbles. Virtual reality allows visits without the physical impact of tourist presence. There are even controversial proposals for digital reconstruction, allowing some remote sections to collapse naturally while preserving them virtually. Is this preservation or surrender? Can the experience of walking on ancient stones, feeling texture, altitude, wind, be replicated digitally? And if it can't, what do we lose by substituting physical presence with digital representation? Climate change introduces new threats. Altered precipitation patterns increase erosion in some areas, while desertification advances in others. Extreme weather events, more intense storms, more severe freeze-thaw cycles accelerate deterioration. Rising temperatures may affect the properties of historical materials in ways we don't yet fully understand. The wall survived 2 millennia of relatively stable climate. Can it survive a century of rapid climate change without massive intervention? Probably not. Culturally, the wall appears in countless forms of media: films, literature, art, video games. Each representation interprets and reimagines, adding layers of meaning. For many people globally, especially young people, their first, and perhaps only, experience of the wall comes through these cultural mediations, not physical visit or historical study. This isn't a lament, just recognition. The wall as a cultural phenomenon exceeds the wall as a physical object. It exists as much in collective imagination as in stone and earth. The myth that the wall is visible from space deserves mention. It isn't, at least not to the naked eye from orbit. But the persistence of this myth reveals our desire for it to be true, for human achievements to be so grand that they transcend terrestrial scale. It's a comforting fiction suggesting that even from a cosmic perspective we matter. Our works are remarkable. The reality that the wall is terrestrially impressive but cosmically insignificant is less comforting, but perhaps more important. It reminds us that we are small, our planet is fragile, and the things we build, no matter how grand they seem, are ephemeral on universal scales. And so the wall lives today in a multiplicity of forms: silent ruins in remote deserts, crowded tourist parks, political symbol, cultural icon, conservation project, climate challenge, metaphor in 1,000 diurent contexts. It contains all these identities simultaneously, refusing to be just one thing. Perhaps that is its true legacy, not the stone itself, but the infinite capacity to generate meaning, interpretation, debate. The wall continues to build itself no longer in earth and brick, but in thoughts and words, a structure that doesn't end as long as we continue looking at it and seeing something, anything, that speaks to us about who we are and what we value. We have traversed centuries of history, crossed thousands of kilometers of stone and earth, encountered countless anonymous lives that bled to erect something that impresses us still today. But now, in this final moment of quiet before sleep, it's worth asking, what does the Great Wall really teach us? Not as historical curiosity, but as a mirror where we can examine universal truths about human ambition, power, sacrifice, impermanence, and memory. The wall teaches us first about the scale of human determination. When Qin Shi Huang ordered the connection of existing walls, he had no modern machinery, no computers for modeling, no trucks for transport. He had only will, his own, absolute and ruthless, and the ability to mobilize millions to execute it. This should impress us, but also disturb us. After all, what else can be achieved when individuals concentrate sufficient power and are willing to ignore human cost? The answer is almost anything, for good or ill. Pyramids, cathedrals, massive dams, space programs, yes, but also concentration camps, organized genocides, industrial-scale environmental destruction. Human capacity for massive undertakings is morally neutral. Everything depends on what we apply it to and who pays the price. It teaches us about the relationship between centralized power and enduring monuments. Almost all great monuments of antiquity, Egyptian pyramids, Mesopotamian ziggurats, temples of Angkor, and yes, the Great Wall, were possible because power was concentrated in the hands of a few who could command resources of many. Ancient and modern democracies built impressive things too, but rarely at the same scale or speed as autocracies. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable trade-off: political systems that maximize individual freedom often can't coordinate long-term EU arts on massive scale, while systems that concentrate power can accomplish grand projects, but usually at the cost of freedom and lives. Which do we prefer? And that choice remains relevant today when we confront global challenges like climate change that require coordination and investment at scales that test democratic capacities. The wall vividly illustrates the diurence between declared and actual EU activeness. It was built to defend against nomadic invasions, and sometimes it worked precisely that way. But it was breached, circumvented, or rendered irrelevant numerous times. The dynasty that invested most in it, Ming, fell not because the wall was militarily conquered, but because treachery opened the gates. This suggests a broader truth. Technical or physical solutions rarely solve problems that are fundamentally human, political, or social. You can build a perfect wall, but if guards are poorly paid and disloyal, if governance is corrupt, if the population is alienated, the wall fails not from engineering defect, but from systemic collapse. How many of our contemporary solutions to complex problems are essentially walls, physical or technical interventions that ignore deeper human dimensions? There's also a lesson about the human cost of grandeur. We celebrate the wall, admire its scale, take smiling selfies on its battlements. But each brick represents suffering. Not metaphorically, literally. Men died placing that brick or the next one or the previous one. Families were shattered, lives were shortened. When we look at historical monuments, how often do we stop to really contemplate that price? And more disturbingly, should we? If every time we admired something historical we had to immerse ourselves in the suffering it cost, we'd probably be paralyzed in our ability to appreciate anything. But completely ignoring that cost also seems morally negligent. Perhaps the balance is to consciously recognize we can admire while also lamenting, we can value the achievement while also mourning those who made it possible at their own cost. The wall shows us how context changes meaning. For centuries, it was viewed negatively by many Chinese, a symbol of oppression, waste, failure. Today it's celebrated as an icon of national pride and ingenuity. The physical object hasn't fundamentally changed, our relationship with it has. This reveals that meaning is not an inherent property of things, but something we assign based on contemporary needs, values, and contexts. When we debate monuments, tearing them down, preserving them, contextualizing them, we're really debating identity, about which narratives we want to tell about ourselves. The wall is stone, but it's also a canvas where we project anxieties, aspirations, and disputes about who we are. It demonstrates the impermanence of even our most durable creations. Sections collapsed, others were dismantled. Even well-preserved ones require constant maintenance to resist erosion, climate, time. Nothing we build is permanent without continuous EUR to maintain it. This contradicts our intuition. We feel that massive things of stone should last forever, but they don't. Without active care, they return to Earth in mere centuries, a blink of an eye on geological scales. If the Great Wall, one of the most massive and durable structures humans have ever built, is fundamentally temporary, what does that say about everything else? Our cities, our institutions, our cultures, all are transitory, maintained only through constant reproduction and renewal. This shouldn't discourage us, but remind us to appreciate the present moment, to actively maintain what we value, because nothing persists by inertia. The experience of working on the wall, brutal tedium interspersed with terror, camaraderie formed under suffering, meaning found or not found in forced labor, echoes in countless human experiences of war, forced labor, massive projects throughout history. The details change, but the emotional and psychological structure persists. This suggests that despite technological and political changes, certain fundamental human experiences are surprisingly constant. Knowing the experience of the wall's builders isn't just learning distant history, it's accessing part of the human condition that remains relevant. And finally, perhaps the most subtle lesson, the wall exists in two places simultaneously. It exists physically, stones in China that you can touch, see, climb. But it also exists culturally and imaginatively, in the thoughts of billions who have never visited and never will, but who know it through images, references, metaphors. This immaterial wall is, in certain senses, more real and impactful than the physical one because it shapes understandings, inspires creativity, functions as a shared reference in global dialogues. Each of us carries our own imaginary version of the wall, and these versions collectively form a cultural phenomenon as monumental as the physical one. So what does the wall teach us? That we are capable of incredible and terrible things, often simultaneously. That greatness has a price we must acknowledge honestly. That meaning is fluid, not fixed, changing with our contexts and needs. That nothing human is permanent, but that the you ought to build and maintain, whether physical structures or communities, cultures, values, is noble precisely because it's endless. That past Su-Yuering deserves remembrance even when we don't know individual names. And that stones, stacked 2,000 years ago by anonymous hands, can still, if we let them, speak truths we need to hear today as we build our own walls, literal or metaphorical, and decide which sacrifices we're willing to demand and what legacy we want to leave for those who come after us. May these reflections accompany you gently as you drift into sleep. The wall remains, winding through mountains and deserts, silently witnessing time pass. And tomorrow, when you wake, it will still be there, waiting patiently to tell its stories to anyone willing to listen.